On behalf of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, and with the support of the Jack Miller Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Lyceum lecture entitled, On a Certain Human Passion, Regulating Hatred on Campus and Beyond. My name is Reese White. I'm a senior economics major and Lyceum scholar here at Clemson University. And I'm pleased to introduce you tonight our speaker, Professor Robert Bartlett. Professor Bartlett is the Baracus Professor of Hellenic Political Studies at Boston College. He specializes his research on classical Greek political philosophy, with particular focus on thinkers such as Thucydides, Aristotle, and Plato. Professor Bartlett has published articles in a number of leading scholarly journals, including the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Politics, and the Journal of Politics. He's also authored several books, including The Idea of Enlightenment, a Postmortem Study, and Sophistry and Political Philosophy, Protagoras' Challenge to Socrates, as well as written on and translated works such as Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and Plato's Protagoras. Before coming to Boston College, Professor Bartlett served as the Arthur M. Blank and National Endowment for the Humanities Distinguished Teaching Professor at Emory University. He earned his BA from the University of Toronto and his MA and PhD from Boston College. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Professor Robert Bartlett.
Thank you, Ruth. That's very nice. Thank you. As that very gracious introduction made clear, my main area of study is classical Greek thought. I will barely mention classical Greek thought tonight, a little bit, but I over the course of summer, wrote this essay or lecture. It's a bit of a departure for me, so we'll see how it goes. First, I want to thank Reese for his introduction and say what a delight it is to be at Clemson University, which I've driven by, but never actually stopped at. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight. And I'm told that after my remarks, there'll be a time for Q&A, so you can come at me if you want to. Good. Understanding the human passions has been among the most important tasks of philosophers, ancient and modern. Aristotle in his Rhetoric, for example, Plato in his Republic, both tried to lay out the passions that animate us. Thomas Hobbes, a little closer to home, the author of the Leviathan, as you may know, contends that the similitude of passions, which are the same in all men, supplies the foundation of his new science. And René Descartes, whom you surely know or know of, in his book, The Passions of the Soul, says you want to know where the ancients, or the moderns rather, are superior to the ancients? Their understanding of the passions. So I say as a kind of preface to this, that I take as a working hypothesis that the human passions are somehow central to figuring out the kind of beings that we are. Now, one among these passions, there must be many, has been singled out lately and become the subject of a lot of discussion, and not only discussion, I think. The concern with this passion has prompted new workplace regulations, for example, that are complete with mandatory training sessions. I've been through one. Some of my neighbors declare on multilingual signs on their front lawns that this passion, quote, has no home here. Even the President of the United States has tweeted that, quote, it has no place in America. So reviled is this passion now that undertaking certain actions while under its influence is a violation of criminal law and therefore, of course, liable to criminal prosecution. And speech that's regarded as giving voice to this passion has to be condemned immediately and forcefully by all decent people. The invective that in an earlier time was reserved for magic and heresy and blasphemy is now vented against this passion. It's become a passion that is to have no home at all. Hatred, which is the subject of my remarks tonight, is a disturbing thing. It's deeply unattractive when we witness someone else in its grip. And it's overwhelming if we ever lose ourselves in it. It surely doesn't bring out anything close to what's best in human beings. Its opposite, which is love, is infinitely more attractive. But is the human soul built in such a way that it's able to love without ever succumbing to its opposite? Odi et amo, said the poet Catullus. I hate and I love. Why do you do this, perhaps you ask? I don't know, but I sense it happening and I am tortured. Aren't we destined to hate at least the things that threaten what we love? The most vocal opponents of quote-unquote hate speech today seem to be influenced by the very passion they officially condemn. Don't they hate at least hate speech? Some, I've noticed, aren't opposed to using in their cause what could well qualify as hate speech. At least one form of hatred, let's call it the hatred of injustice, retains its home here. And as is often the case when a new moral mood takes hold, self-awareness seems to be the first thing that goes. So the concern with hatred today, at least as a matter of public policy, takes two main forms, as I've already implied. First, the prohibition against hate speech, as it's called, and legislation against hate crimes. And tonight I want to try and focus on the first, on regulations against hate speech, although I will say a word about hate crime legislation too, but more briefly. Now I want to say this before I begin, because some of you may be wondering where I'm coming from, what's my angle. I am not unsympathetic to those who promote these regulations. But I think it's worthwhile at least to consider the costs of doing so. And that is my chief aim with you this evening, an admittedly modest aim. So first we have to ask the preliminary question, a la Socrates. What is hatred? The question is easier to ask than it is to answer, because I think we understand it the least when we're closest to it. And so we have to try to approach that question in a dispassionate way, without feeling it ourselves. But to approach so despised a thing today in that way, dispassionately, may itself cause some trouble. We'll see. To begin from the simplest thing, hatred. It's a passion, of course, I've said that already. But what exactly is a passion? The word seems to have entered the English language in the late 12th century by way of the Old French and its Latin antecedent passio, and the verb patior. I should have a Latin quiz at the end of this lecture, which means, of course, to suffer or undergo, and the still earlier Greek pascho, which means the same thing, and it's noun pathos. So we have pathos, passio, and passion. The English word was first used, apparently, to express the idea of the passion, or passions, the sufferings of Christ, culminating in the crucifixion. Crucial both to this meaning and to the more common one today, of just the human emotions generally, is the idea that the passions are something we undergo or suffer. They happen to us as if from outside. Yeah? You can't decide to become angry, yeah? Or choose to be afraid. That's just play acting. Those aren't real passions. They happen to us and we're suddenly angry or afraid. That hatred in particular has until recently been regarded as necessary to the architecture of the human soul isn't so hard to see. I mentioned Hobbes, so I'll go back to him. Hobbes argues that it's part of human nature to be guided by attraction to some things and what he calls aversion to others. And Hobbes says, when the object of our aversion is present to us, we hate it. Yes? So I have an aversion to snakes, and when the anaconda falls in my lap, I hate it. I hate the thing that I have an aversion to when it's right in front of me. Hobbes, however, says that we are bound to love and to hate. That's just the kind of creatures we are. We have aversions and attractions to things. Aristotle, too, presents hatred together with its opposite of love. We hate someone or something, he says, because it's a member of a class or kind that we think, at least, is exceedingly bad, and to that extent promises us harm. Quote, everybody hates the thief and the sycophant. Now, the relevance of this to contemporary concerns, to race and ethnicity above all, I think is obvious. According to Aristotle, experiencing hatred isn't painful in itself. But pleasure or pain, he says, accompanies all the passions. By the way, he says anger, that's a pain. But it's a pain that goes together with a pleasure, particular pleasure. Insofar as you're angry at someone and you think you have the prospect of getting back at that bastard, it's intensely pleasant. But he says hatred isn't painful. But is there pleasure attached to it? He doesn't say. Maybe we receive some pleasure in hating from the foundation of that hatred. What's that? It's the conviction that we are superior to some class or kind. If not necessarily in strength, than injustice or morality or purity. And so to reject that other kind, to hate it, is also to affirm and embrace one's own. Hatred has love as its opposite, but more particularly it presupposes the love of one's own. Hatred rests on the conviction of the rightness or the goodness of who and what we are. And the soul-shaking intensity of hatred amounts to a kind of confirmation of that difference, be it a mark of one's justified superiority or of one's unjustified inferiority. As Aristotle says, hatred can be a bond of friendship. You can bring people together in their hatred. All of this is compatible with the fact that explosive anger fades in time, but hatred smolders. As Aristotle says, time cures anger, but not hatred. In fact, our anger at a given person, and we're always angry at a particular person, according to Aristotle, we may even feel pity about that guy. Yeah? He got the promotion, you're so angry at that guy, you deserved it, and then you hear that he suffered a terrible car accident one day. You think, oh my God. I mean, I wanted that bastard to suffer, but I didn't want that. So your anger can be quelled easily. But according to Aristotle, for the object of our hatred, no such pity is possible. Quote, he who hates wants the object of his hatred to cease to exist. Poof, I want you gone. Anger can exhaust itself in punishment, but hatred exhausts itself, if it ever does, in the annihilation of what we hate. And like Hobbes, Aristotle says that the passion of hatred is just necessary to us. It's part of the beings who we are. So what should we make of this sweeping repudiation today of this passion? What we mean, I think, is to condemn only the specific hatred of groups that are judged, stupidly and wrongly, inhumanely, to be inferior to another. So it's not so much hatred as such, then, that actually is being rejected today, as hatred against, for example, particular races or ethnicities or genders. That's to be denounced and rejected, and as the case may be, hated. We might wish that it were otherwise, but the passion that is hatred belongs to us as the creatures that we are, as I've said, as a fact of our human nature or divine creation. And it's not so surprising that, if that's a fact, let's take it as a fact, that in fact hatred had a rather more elevated place in our tradition than it now has. From Proverbs, for example, quote, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, and so on. And wisdom, personified again in Proverbs, tells us that, quote, the fear of the Lord is hatred of evil. Pride and arrogance in the way of evil and perverted speech I hate. Even the Prince of Peace is not simply opposed to it. At any rate, in the Gospel of Luke, as you may know, Jesus teaches this, quote, if someone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and further his own soul, he cannot be my disciple. Now, as you may know, this statement has prompted a lot of commentary. But Jesus speaks of hatred nonetheless. And the philosopher Socrates, that very gentle soul, he too speaks of it. He speaks of hating what he calls the true lie, the lie that resides in one's own soul about the most important things. This, he said, is something that both gods and human beings alike hate. This isn't to deny, in a way it's to assert, that the primary thing is love. But, as I say, even Socrates speaks of hatred. According to him, we long to possess the truth about the most important things. And I say this as an exhortation before I now turn to the main event, which is a discussion of regulating hate speech today. So I want to give a very brief history of the rise of so-called hate speech regulations, especially on college campuses. But first, a general point. The proponents of hate speech regulations have rightly noted that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment is every bit as much a part of the Constitution as is the First Amendment. In other words, they've argued that the demands of free speech, First Amendment, have to be balanced against those of equality of treatment. Or as a leading feminist put it rather more ominously, the law of equality and the law of freedom of speech are on a collision course in this country. The view that, quote, the constitutional doctrine of free speech has developed without taking equality seriously, seems widely held by the left, it seems to me, and very authoritative voices on campus today have made it their mission to give equality what they regard as its due. It's time, in a way, to give equality its due, especially the new equality not of opportunity, but of result called equity. Now, you can see the effect of this emphasis on equality over liberty in many things. For example, in which causes get traction, and even how we speak of them. Think, for example, of gay marriage. You could speak of gay marriage and promote it in terms of the freedom to marry. But at least in my experience, it's almost always presented as marriage equality. If it's presented as promoting equality, then you got traction. Even if you agree with Justice Cardozo's dictum that freedom of speech is, quote, the matrix, the indispensable condition of nearly every other freedom, equality has so much gained the other hand that freedom, at least in my experience, is hardly spoken of on campus anymore. Maybe that's different at Clemson. I'll find out soon. That's freedom. I would say I never hear of liberty. I was once at a committee meeting, a special kind of academic hell, and I mentioned liberty in connection with liberal education, and my colleague said, I'm just not comfortable with the word liberty. And so we moved on from there. I offended her. And evidently to be comfortable is the highest thing that an academic could aspire to. Let me give a brief history now of the rise of this. The main authors of the theoretical justification of campus speech codes were all legal scholars, writing in the 1980s and early 1990s. It's a striking fact. This is true also, I believe, of critical race theory, which also had its home in the law schools. In sometimes deeply personal and moving language, these scholars detailed the harm, the psychological, educational, even physical harm that racial slurs and slights can cause. Such slights are always, quote, a dignitary affront, a violation, direct violation of the victim's right to be treated respectfully. They are a psychic tax imposed on those least able to pay. Still quoting, racial epithets and harassment often cause deep emotional scarring and feelings of anxiety and fear that pervade every aspect of a victim's life, close quote. That harmful effect is instantaneous upon the hearing, even as it may rely on past decades of injustices. The harm involved amounts to a kind of assault that the law should punish and so help prevent. Now, being law professors, the original advocates of speech codes relied on a variety of constitutional arguments. For example, the rather novel contention that Brown v. Board of Education is properly seen as a free speech case, that the court was willing to strike down the message that separate but equal sends to minorities and to the nation at large. Much more recently than that, a distinguished law professor, Jeremy Waldron, has made the case for hate speech regulations in every democratic community on two grounds. First, that prohibiting such speech fosters the public good of what he calls inclusiveness. And second, that such prohibitions protect the dignity of vulnerable minorities, not in the sense of just some Kantian aura, as he calls it, but in that of the continuing assurance to minorities that they're full members of the political community. So I'm just trying to sketch here, very briefly, the theoretical constructs of the original arguments and some updated arguments. Now, the original arguments in support of campus speech codes elicited strong reaction, criticism, also from other legal scholars. That fact surprised me. The most influential of those was probably Nadinestrassen, who at the time was a professor of law at NYU, and for a long time headed up the ACLU. She's the opposite of a conservative. She's a staunch defender, however, of the First Amendment, and she brings out especially the constitutional objects to such speech codes, which are too numerous and detailed for me to repeat here. I'm not a lawyer. But she found unpersuasive, for example, the attempt to make of Brown a free speech case, and in particular, a foundation for limiting, quote, private racist speech as distinguished from racist state action. That you can take action against, racist state action. Just as she holds that, quote, prohibiting racist speech would not effectively counter and could even aggravate the underlying problem of racism. Now, we don't have to decide here and now on the merits of these somewhat detailed, complicated, precedent-filled arguments of Strassen and others. Why not? Because such arguments or counter-arguments as one observer put it, quote, had little effect on the adoption and enforcement of speech codes by those universities that wanted them. In other words, the regulations banning hate speech that were first seen on college campuses in the late 1980s continued to multiply. So there was a kind of fierce debate in the law schools, pro and con, and it started to bleed outside of the law schools. But nonetheless, these things began to grow and grow and grow on college campuses, speech codes. By 1994, over 350 public colleges and universities had some form of speech code in place. I looked at the Clemson website and couldn't find one, but that doesn't mean it ain't there, I don't know. These codes were prompted in part by the sense of what has been called, quote, a resurgence of racial violence and a corresponding rise in the incidence of verbal and symbolic assault and harassment on campuses. However, the data supporting this claim that I just quoted proved to be controversial because the lead author of the report I just quoted admitted that, quote, there is no way of knowing whether any upsurge of racial harassment at colleges is actually occurring. Similarly, another scholar put it, it's impossible to say definitively whether there was a real increase in racist events on campus or whether they were simply being more publicized. There were no systematic data on such cases. But I would say still, all right, any level of racial harassment, whether it's surging or not, is despicable and demands redress. But what form should that redress take? To judge from their fate before the courts, not campus speech codes, without exception, the codes that face judicial challenge all founded on the rock of the First Amendment free speech clause. In a dozen cases stretching from 1989 to 2012, not that long ago, courts consistently ruled against speech codes on campus. The courts found these to be either overbroad, vague, or content biased, or some combination of those things. Overbroad in the sense that they included speech that was clearly protected by the First Amendment, so they were out. Vague in that they leave it unclear precisely which behaviors were forbidden, and therefore made compliance very difficult. I don't know what's in and what's out. And content biased in that they prohibited only certain ideas or convictions, what's called in the legal trade impermissible viewpoint discrimination. And so all of the decisions basically came to the same conclusion from one root or another, that these speech codes had a chilling effect on the universities. But, and this point I want to stress, the legal failure of speech codes before the bar did not quite lead to their demise. Why not? Because what the courts strike down as unconstitutional do not necessarily cease to exist or to have some effect on the broader society, yes? As one observer put it, quote, with academe, the media, and internet service providers, we could say Facebook and Twitter, willing to tamp down hate speech, with majorities of the public now concluding that a person's right to speak should give way when the message is racist or offensive, the informal law of mass constitutionalism exerts influence over civil society. That's just a term of art, mass constitutionalism. He means just because it's not on paper doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect in our hearts and our heads. Accordingly, concerns about hate speech, or the other side of the coin, if you like, misgivings about free speech, are a felt presence on many campuses today. So, in sum, the heyday of speech codes as a matter of formal law was over by the 1990s. It was a done deal. But those codes have, in effect, remained or returned, this time as a matter of more or less informal social pressure, let's call it. So, how to begin to assess the current state of the matter? I think it's worth noting at the outset that those most likely to view appeals to free speech with deep suspicion today are very much of the left, while those most likely to make such appeals are generally dubbed libertarians or conservatives. Though I think if you dig a little, you see that they're mostly rather old-fashioned liberals. This is a very strange reversal. Over the course of the 20th century, it was the liberal or progressive left, including socialists and communists, who were the most inclined to appeal to the First Amendment with varying degrees of success. The natural enemy, you could say, of the First Amendment was McCarthyism, and not at all the civil rights movement. As Benjamin Hooks of the NAACP once put it, the civil rights movement would have been vastly different without the shield and the spear of the First Amendment. We've gone somehow from the free speech movement at Berkeley to the hate speech movement almost everywhere. And now aging liberals are caught uncomfortably between the noble cause of their youth, free speech, and the identity politics of today. And this reversal suggests at least a lesson worth mulling over. Those who are most eager to curtail free speech rights in the name of achieving a signal moral progress right now may one day find themselves trying to cling to those same rights, maybe in vain. Moral momentum, ladies and gentlemen, has a way of shifting in directions that it's hard to predict. It's worth noting, too, that the intended beneficiaries of speech codes have sometimes been their unintended victims, because it's very difficult to predict just who will get caught up in the complicated logic of speech codes. According to Eleanor Holmes Norton, it's technically impossible to write an anti-speech code that can't be twisted against speech nobody means to bar. It's been tried and tried and tried. Or to return to the case of campus codes, a University of Michigan student in a second-year dentistry class, which had the reputation of being very difficult, said in a group exercise that was meant to discuss the problems that the students anticipated that he had heard that minority students had a hard time in the class and were treated unfairly. Well, the professor, who herself was a minority, filed a complaint against the student, whose official punishment included counseling and writing a letter of apology. Henry Louis Gates Jr. noted this about one pioneering campus hate speech code, quote, "A full disciplinary hearing was conducted only in the case of a black social work student who was charged with saying, in a class discussion of research projects, that he believed that homosexuality was an illness and that he was developing a social work approach to move homosexuals towards homosexuality. And so he was brought up on, got into trouble and had to face a disciplinary hearing." Let me say this. If arguments in defense of free speech are ever crowded out or shouted down once and for all by those who would prohibit so-called hate speech, then the modern university is done. It's sunk. It will cease to be the principal location of the freest possible inquiry in a liberal democracy. Now, such a fate may be quite unlikely if I say, a lively respect for the First Amendment continues to characterize influential parts of the community, of the nation. On the one hand, we can readily agree with the call for civility and mutual respect in the classroom and outside the classroom, for that matter. No scholar known to me advocates an absolutist approach to the First Amendment on campus. In other words, that anything goes, any speech act. I don't know anyone who advocates that position. But, on the other hand, to claim to promote the toleration and openness needed for a thriving intellectual community by attacking the principle of free speech as a phony cover for hate speech is to use an atom bomb to kill what is at most a wasp's nest. I am not denying that there have been ugly incidents on campuses over the decades, where the progress remains to be made. But just how many such incidents there are is a notoriously difficult question, even leaving aside the problem of false flag provocations. Now, maybe we should take some solace, oddly enough, in the recent rise of concern over implicit bias and microaggressions. I'm sure you've heard these terms. These imply that the explicit bias and the macroaggressions are very much on the decline, and that a heightened sensitivity and even special training are now needed for most people to detect these slights that are not really aggressive, in fact. And presumably, microaggressions should only give rise to micro-offense. This much seems certain. Colleges and universities today are mostly fortresses of liberal progressivism. Many have astonishingly big budgets. They deploy a phalanx of full-time administrators, earning its keep by devising new ways to secure diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they boast a faculty mostly eager to comply with the latest demands or initiatives, as they're called, as these bubble up from below or filter down from above, or both. Are our institutions of higher learning really so rife with hate speech as to require the extreme measure of denigrating freedom of speech. I say that they are not. An Ann Coulter here, a Milo Yiannopoulos there, does not a crisis make. Students should be equipped with minds educated and informed enough to know a silly caricature when they see one, and then they should get back to their serious work. It's in this connection that I think it's important to see how strange is the very phrase hate speech. Just as criticism of homosexuality may not be traceable in all cases to homophobia, because a phobia is by definition a pathological fear that needs psychiatric treatment. So not all speech that somebody finds offensive or hurtful needs stem from hatred. It may result instead from a very sincerely held set of opinions or prejudices or principles that are untouched by that passion. The devout evangelical Christian may regard her criticisms of abortion, say, or gay marriage as the product of precisely love, Christian love, as she understands it. That message may be wrong, it may be annoying, it may even be offensive, but it ain't hate speech. That the listener may hate hearing it is quite another matter. Is this, after all, an important part of the meaning of hate speech? A description of my visceral reaction to speech that I hate? But think about that. Catering to that would mean regulating speech by the barometer of any or every student's subjective reaction to an argument or line of inquiry, whether it's anger, hurt, offense, whatever, discomfort, like my colleague who doesn't want to be uncomfortable. Unstable passion would finally overtake dispassionate reason as the arbiter on campus. And reason at the best of times is very fragile. Now, maybe it will be said that what matters is not the reaction of every student, but only that of members of vulnerable communities, as one scholar put it. I myself find this argument very powerful, actually. But all I would say is that it has to be balanced against its possible difficulties. These difficulties, it seems to me, include the paternalism, the condescension, the soft bigotry of low expectations, to use a phrase, that's risked by such a segregated approach to monitoring and then punishing offense-giving to some. Doesn't this amount to insisting that some students lack the wherewithal, the stuff, to engage in intellectual debate? Partitioning off segments of students for special and gentler treatment in the matter of speech or expression also raises questions of basic fairness, I think, that can't be ignored if the university is to continue as a community. A danger in the current climate, it seems to me, is that arguments or even questions found by anybody to be out of bounds can be silenced by detonating the bomb that is the accusation of hate speech. That's racist, that's sexist, that's homophobic. These are not an invitation to a difficult conversation. They're the foreclosing of a difficult conversation. The definition of these terms is necessarily up to the accuser, and so the would-be interlocutor has to try to anticipate them, or failing that, to remain quiet. Surely self-imposed silence will be the preferred option in many cases. There's now a term of art which one hears, at least I hear more and more, self-censorship. I'm just not going to go there. As a thoroughly liberal progressive defender of free speech put it recently, with what today I think constitutes rather amazing daring, quote, "Is it racist to counter Black Lives Matter with a demand that all lives matter? Is it racist to call racial sensitivity training divisive anti-American propaganda? Is it racist to label critical race theory cult indoctrination? Is it racist to argue that affirmative action programs constitute reverse discrimination against whites?" And so on. It's not that the very liberal left-leaning person who said this was advocating that's what we should say, but he's asking the question whether you can even ask that question anymore. One result of this new sensitivity to crossing an ill-defined line is that students, at least my students, are by and large exceedingly cautious, even to the point of comedy, when questions of race or gender arise. On a couple of occasions, I've had a student, in describing another student to me whom I didn't know but was to meet up with, omit all mention of the fact that the student I was to meet was Black in one case and Asian in another, as I subsequently discovered. They said, quote, "He has dark hair." Said the co-chair of Stanford's Native American Student Association, When it reaches the point that sensitivity stifles communication, it's gone too far. To surveil and punish offense giving is to elevate offense taking. It's the thing to be constantly alive to in yourself and declare it as soon as you feel it. We become walking Geiger counters for offense. It's the thing to be deferred to in another. That's offensive, is no longer a modestly interesting report of what may or may not be somebody's gut reaction. Today, it amounts to a cease and desist order. Stop. This is not just corrosive of the free give-and-take exchange that properly belongs in the college classroom. It's also psychologically debilitating. It fosters in students the opposite of gritty independence of mind. It makes their sense of self-worth depend too much on the approval of anyone or everyone else. And that means they become particularly vulnerable. For if I am genuinely offended by what you say to me or even in my presence, I am thereby conferring on you a very high honor of taking you and your judgment with utmost seriousness. It's untrue, I grant, that only sticks and stones can hurt me. But the words of an ignoramus or dupe or bigot should never do so. Such people literally don't know what they're saying. Booker T. Washington reports this about the great Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was told to sit in the baggage car of the train for which he booked passage. And some white passengers were embarrassed and apologized to him for his being, quote, degraded in this manner. And this is what Booker T. Washington reports, quote, Mr. Douglass straightened himself up on the box upon which he'd been sitting and replied, "They cannot degrade, Frederick Douglass. The soul that is within me, no man can degrade. I am not the one that's being degraded on account of this treatment, but those who are inflicting it upon me." I fear that we cultivate, without meaning to, a psychological dependence and fragility in our students, minority and non-minority alike. And I'm sure with the best of intentions, we confirm such weakness in them. They need safe spaces. In truth, students need less to be protected from speech than to be taught to use the protection of speech, which is to say reason. Students most need, in other words, the resilience that can come only from tough-minded, clear-eyed, hard-won independence. Self-esteem workshops won't cut it. Then again, if the declaration of offense or the detection of supposed hate speech is enough to bring any discussion to a halt, and in some cases to threaten a career, it confers considerable power on the alleged offended. There's an electrifying and enticing power available today to the indignant college students that can make the claim of victimhood deeply appealing. Hence the sometimes performative or histrionic displays of student outrage, especially when in big groups, an outrage that seems not without its pleasures. The very phrase hate speech has something histrionic about it. Imagine being a sophomore and discovering that you have the power to make mostly white, mostly male, certainly middle-aged administrators, to say nothing of old fogey professors, quake in their boots, yes? That's heady stuff. Who's grading whom now? That this newfound sense of power has, on a few occasions, resulted in violence against speakers or faculty, Exhibit A, Middlebury College, is evidence that the denigration of the right to free speech has begun to have its predictable effects. Just how far down the rot has gone is difficult to say. Now I want to say just a few words more briefly about hate crime legislation. How was Professor Bartlett's talk? I hated it. This would be a good response. So I want to say a few words about hate crime legislation. In comparison to those who tried to combat hate speech by means of positive law, the advocates of legislation against hate crimes have been extremely successful. So as a matter of law, hate speech codes didn't work. As a matter of law, hate crime legislation has been hugely successful. At the last check, 47 states and the District of Columbia have hate crime enhancement laws, and of course there's a raft of federal laws on hate crimes, yes? Enhancement laws are those that mean this. If somebody's found guilty of an underlying crime, they're liable to more punishment, enhanced punishments, if some bias is found at work in the crime. Bias being the term of art here. According to the FBI, for example, it defines a hate crime as a traditional offense like murder, arson, or vandalism with an added element of bias. Now, there's this considerable variety among the states, what they punish, how they punish, and so on, but there is an overwhelming majority of states that now have these laws on the books. South Carolina, by the way, is one of the three that does not have hate crime legislation. But what are we to make of as a matter of principle, yes? It's easy to see that the thing that's criminalized in the first place is the act. Assault, arson, whatever, vandalism, yes? It is not the thought or the passion that's criminalized in the first place. In fact, without the underlying criminal act, there cannot be a hate crime. That is clear. But it seems true by definition, I think, that hate crimes are punished because of the passion or the opinion that motivated them. And once we begin to hunt for illicit passions in criminal acts, we may find them almost everywhere, with the possible exception of mob assassinations. Isn't most murder, for example, marked by hatred of the victim? Now, a hate crime may be a passion crime, so to speak, but it isn't treated by our law as a crime of passion. Why not? Because crime of passion usually has less, not more penalties, because of precisely the mitigating effect of the passion. I killed her in a moment of anger, yes, or outrage. But hatred evidently is different. It's not like anger or these other ones. And several reasons have been used in support of hate crime legislation. For example, it's not just the immediate victim of the crime, which is true of all crime, but the group, the identical group to which the victim belongs. That's one argument, yes? But I think the deepest and the most powerful justification, actually, is surely the revulsion that our nation feels at the thing itself, at racially motivated acts from which ordinary decency recoils. The criminal law, accordingly, is regarded as a crucial means to express, and I quote, society's commitment to the norm against prejudice. Yeah. In other words, the fact of having hate crime legislation on the books sends a message very much worth sending, according to its advocates, even if the legislation relatively rarely issues in convictions, which seems to be true, and is of questionable use in actually combating hatred. In fact, some have contended that it only exacerbates the problem. Now, it's possible to be entirely sympathetic to the goal of hate crime legislation, which I am, while having reservations about it, which I do. And my reservations stem from my main area of study, which is political theory, and in particular from the great tradition of classical liberal thought. Because there is a liberal case against punishing the hatred in hate crimes. And that can be summed up by this very simple sentence of the great Oracle Montesquieu, as Madison called him, the great French philosopher who was so influential on the American founding. This is what Montesquieu said, quote, "Laws are charged with punishing only external actions." Yeah? This is the conclusion of his chapter titled On Thoughts in his Spirit of the Laws. In this section of the book, Montesquieu is particularly concerned with reforming the penal code, the criminal law, because this was going to be the bedrock, the foundation of a new liberal order. Yes? And he said that the citizen's liberty depends principally on the goodness of the criminal laws. And so Montesquieu stressed very much that the law as law can only get at the external action. Did you set the house on fire? Did you assault the guy? And so on. And that when or if the criminal law begins to dig around in the soul or the mind to get at the thoughts behind the act, then that, according to Montesquieu, was a recipe for tyranny. Yes? Speech does not form a corpus delicti. It remains only an idea, he says. And so you have to have the greatest realm first for speech, but then behind that, ideas or thoughts, which should be invulnerable to the greatest extent possible to the reach of the law, the criminal law. So you have to punish the external actions only. This was Montesquieu's great concern. He lived in a time when a person's convictions about God were still regarded as the greatest political importance. And so in order to protect political liberty, he took as his first task removing questions of religious heterodoxy, what he called magic and heresy, from the purview of the state. In other words, he was one of the great founders of what we know as the separation of church and state. This is part of his great innovation. As I've already suggested, the place once reserved for concerns about magic and heresy, blasphemy, that has been filled in our time by the concern for a different sort of moral and doctrinal purity. But it seems that a kind of religious fervor remains. Now, as I said, Montesquieu's great work, The Spirit of the Laws, did a lot to separate church from state as we know it. And it was a great accomplishment of liberal republicanism, like the United States, to mark out a respectable sphere, a private sphere. There's the state or the public sphere, but then there's a respectable private sphere. And the collection of all those private spheres we call civil society, yes? And so the state should deal principally with the public life and regulate the civil society to the least degree possible. As the love of liberty in our time is giving way, I think, to the love of equality, some of the protections that were judged necessary to liberal government are losing their power and certainly their self-evident character. As it seems to me, the partisan embrace of hate crime legislation, bipartisan embrace of hate crime legislation in the United States is an important sign of something. It's a sign of the failure of the promise of liberalism, the failure to secure both private liberty and public tranquility, at least in a manner judged adequate by many citizens. It's come to seem completely inadequate to regulate state action vis-a-vis the individual while leaving the private sphere more or less alone, where you can find a whole bunch of very beautiful and very ugly opinions, depending. In principle, at least, the bigot in liberal democracy can despise as he likes, provided he breaks no criminal laws. But the presence of such citizens now is an intolerable affront to others in precisely their private affairs. And so it's not just individual political rights anymore, but civil or group rights that have to be protected, or so it seems. And so it seemed to be a moral obligation for the state to alter the thoughts, the passions in the private sphere, that the law hadn't gone far enough in punishing only external actions. It had to get at the root, and the root was the soul, yes, the individual opinions. No wonder then, this occurred to me just in listening on campuses, it's no wonder then that the language of toleration, for example, has vanished today. You very rarely hear toleration anymore, in favor of the need for equal dignity, inclusion, and so on. Because to tolerate somebody may amount to letting the other fellow go about his business while you hold your nose, maybe your tongue, with your private loathings very much intact. We're witnesses now to the rejection in the United States of the liberal arrangement, again, public tranquility and private liberty, in favor of a certain understanding of equality that has to pervade the whole of life, public and private. It has to penetrate to the innermost reaches of every heart and mind. I end now with one observation. Criminalizing the passion of hatred, I think, would have troubled the great architects of liberalism like Montesquieu. But that's not because they were indifferent to hatred, that they didn't care. Far from it. It's rather because they were keenly alive to its true potency, its power. They knew from study and from experience the lethal sectarian hatreds that are mostly unknown to us. And yet, because we're told to believe that race is the single most important fact of human life, public and private, it took a predictably short time for certain self-appointed representatives of the so-called white one to assert themselves in rather ugly ways. In seeking to purify opinions and passions, not now in the name of God, but in the name of equality, we don't seem yet to have reduced the sum total of hatred and resentment in the world. We may even be increasing it. And that, I think, is a cause for concern. Thank you very much. And now the Inquisition. I'm happy to take any questions or just comments. Yes, sir.
So I've got two questions. The first question would be...
Well, you only get a second if the first isn't too hard.
So at what point does allowing hate speech under the enforcement of the First Amendment enables and promotes hate speech?
I'm not sure I followed the question.
Like, I
Yeah.
typical venue of free speech.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that comes with allowing hate speech.
I see. Yes.
At what point do we toe that? How do we toe that line of allowing free speech while condemning hate speech? Is there no consequence? What should that look like?
Yeah, it's a very good, but also a very difficult question. You ask a serious practical question. And I suppose my main concern was, I don't have a set of policy recommendations. I didn't do that, and I'm not sure that I could. In fact, I think I can't. My main concern was this, that in bringing a hammer down on it, it causes a great many problems. I think it's an ugly thing, and we want to be rid of ugly things. All right, but then the question is of strategy. And I wonder whether in explicitly prohibiting it or excluding it, whatever it is, it has to be defined, and that would shift. We run the risk of greater polarization, and in a way, a greater prevalence of hate, of the thing we're trying to be rid of. So it's not so much, I suspect, a question of the goal. I want as civil, political, and private discourse as one can have. The question is more how to achieve that, and I think that's a very difficult thing. If we're talking about universities and colleges, which we were at least for a lot of my remarks, then I think the boundaries should be greater. And that the default position of certainly the administration is to permit free speech, and the onus of those who would limit it should be on those who are limiting it, and they would have to justify the limitation, something like that. But I don't have a specific policy recommendation. In a way, your question brings up how difficult these things are. We could agree theoretically or on a certain principle, but then applying it when there's 100 real human beings in a room is much more difficult. But your second point.
I guess it kind of went in with the first one as far as, kind of finding that line and enforcing.
Yeah.
Obviously, nobody wants, very, not nebulous, but very direct, racist speech, things
Right.
very clear slurs.
Right.
Just kind of leave it.
Right. But on the other hand, I would say, if you're discussing Huckleberry Finn, or Randall Kennedy's a famous law professor at Harvard who wrote a book whose title is the N-word, but he didn't use the N-word, he used the real word. I think if you have a group of adults who are discussing a book by a Harvard law professor, one could use the title. And now I just didn't, so I'm not living up to my own principle. But we don't live in the world that I would like to have, so. On the other hand, so in those cases, I think it should be, while acknowledging the extraordinary freight of that word and its import, I think adults should be able to discuss it in a serious and open way, which would include, by the way, statements from people in the room of how ugly a word it is and so on. Whereas if it's hurled across the cafeteria, that's a very different thing, and I think most people of common sense would agree that it's a very different thing. That if you're discussing Twain, the intent is not to inflict a wound on someone. Whereas if you hurl it in anger across the dorm, you are. And that would have to be adjudicated separately, it seems to me. But we're now at a position where all of it, I think, is simply prohibited. And again, I think that's problematic, and in part because it may foment a reaction that none of us wants. Yes?
So if we're trying to combat postmodern scholars, everybody who wants proponents of hate speech regulation, which is a more effective argument? Like a moral argument just on the basis of free speech, like a utilitarian mechanism like John Stuart's Mill, the marketplace of ideas, being that discussion could ultimately lead to tolerance, which is their goal. Does that mean the second is a more effective argument in their opinion? Like we're debating or something?
Yeah. My guess is that the second probably would be more effective. It has its limits too. The second, at least as I understand it, along million lines, is that the best antidote to bad speech is more speech, better speech, rather than trying to curtail the bad speech that's there. I think that has some problems and some limits, but as a rule of thumb, I think that's better, especially in a community like this one. That is to say, an intellectual community, a college or university. Do you have an opinion on the question?
I don't know, but based on some of the clubs I'm involved in, I would definitely say the latter is more effective strategy because when you try to argue on a moral basis, there's just an aversion at this point to the idea of
Yeah.
We can get into the ideas of it. It's pretty much worth this point in some of the realms of academia.
That's an extremely interesting remark, and I'm grateful for the data point, datum, the empirical evidence that free speech, in a way, that's in a way confirms my worst fear, that free speech is regarded as a kind of joke, or as, how did I put it, a phony cover for something ugly and nasty that you want to slip in. Yes?
Can you make a distinction between hate speech and libel, particularly how the courts have handled those in the past?
Would I? Yes. But I defer to the lawyers in the room. Are you a lawyer? Yes.
So when you were talking about Montesquieu's conclusion, the laws can only deal with external acts, I started thinking about heresy laws.
Yes.
I can deny the Trinity in my mind, but it doesn't become heresy until I say that, I start presenting Nicene Creed or something.
Right.
So is it really ever possible for the lawgiver to draw a distinction between external and internal acts?
Well, but Montesquieu went one step further. He says you should be able, in speech, to deny it and to be left alone. He has a very nice remark. If you do something which wounds the divinity can take care of himself. Well, I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. So, he wanted you to be able to be free to say that. I mean, that's why he's a liberal, small L liberal, And now, if you attacked a church, it's private property and so on, and then you'd be liable to prosecution. Yeah, I take your main point, and I think it's a serious one, and it's very late in the story of liberal democracy. How late, I don't know. And these sorts of practical questions, sober practical questions have arisen. Is there really such a fine line, or a sharp line, I should say, between speech and action? But I think Montesquieu's view is, yeah, I know there can be difficulties in gray areas, but let's draw a sharp line anyway. Because he saw, or he argued at least, that way lies a kind of tyranny. Because then the self-understanding of the law is to get into the soul and start molding it. I mean, one argument is, which I find very powerful, is that law always does that. And so if you accept, as Thomas Jefferson did, the idea that it makes no difference whether my neighbor believes in 20 gods or no gods, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. That has an effect, too, on people's souls, but that's a separate question. It's a related question, but perhaps we don't want to go there. Thank you. Luca.
Do you think that there are some cases in which the liberal regime has an interest in purifying the opinions and passions of people? A case that comes to mind is Twitter banning Donald Trump. I know that's not the government, but it seems to me that...
Almost. Soon.
But it seems to me that the damage done by Donald Trump being on Twitter may add more to the anger and hatred of the people than banning him. So what do you think about, especially with modern technology, having to affect massive amounts of people, does the liberal regime have a role in purifying, in some cases, opinions and passions?
Yeah, in a way, it gets back to the tail end of what I said to this gentleman's question. There's the classical liberal position where there's the public sphere, the state, and you engage in that in certain actions, but that your private life is your private life, including religious opinions and others, and that the state should stay out of that. That's a kind of classic liberal position. But it's not so clear that that's really workable in practice or to what extent it is. And you raise the question whether it isn't a good thing for the liberal, at least I think this is what you're saying, that there are some ugly things that could do with some purifying or cleaning up. And so why shouldn't we use all of the tools available to us to do some cleaning? The classic answer, if I could put it that way, the usual answer is that you don't know what you're wishing for. That you're opening a box that you think contains nothing but beautiful, shiny objects. And in fact, there are, I don't know how far I can push the metaphor, there are snakes in that box. In other words, you envision a world in which once we start purifying, that the world is going to look very much the way Luca wants it to look, like a mirror, you know. I know this gentleman slightly, so I can abuse him publicly. But that's not so. Montesquieu and the others were not so hopeful. That there's a kind of bedrock belief, perhaps in many people, that the truth will win out, and there's a kind of progress, inevitable progress, bumps along the way and so on, but inevitable progress. And I think the older philosophers were not so hopeful that these things will take care of themselves. You also mentioned, to go back to Twitter, which is a private company, you know, it's not a government agency, at least not officially, and the realm of technology. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me, I'm old enough that when I was in college, I typed my papers, and when I was in graduate school, I did them on a Mac. So I was present at the revolution, which doesn't mean I understand it. I don't think I do. But I didn't have a cell phone until I was 40. You know? It's not so clear to me that, and this is a trite observation, that the world is a better place because of it. And many people have observed, and it seems to me true, that what it does tends to foment or agitate, and therefore also to bring out the extremes, even to some extent to create the extremes. You can do it anonymously and so on. So I don't know. You know, whether Trump should have been banned or not, I don't know. He certainly used it effectively as a forum for his purposes. But maybe, you know, from the classic liberal position, we should have said, give him 4 Twitter accounts. But the people who want to purify the world should have 4 Twitter accounts too. I know that's not an altogether satisfying solution. Look, I mean, the reason why I wrote this paper, which is very different from the sorts of things I do, as I said at the beginning, is because I too was puzzled and worried about certain developments, and I just tried to understand them a little better. And I suppose the next step should be to come up with proposals to make the world a better place, but that's above my pay grade. Yes, please.
What do you make of arguments like we're trying to accomplish a particular thing on university campuses, i.e. pursuit of truth, in a sense, racial slurs or insecure language aren't based in truth, they should be tolerated?
Well, I'm sympathetic to that argument. My only, and I also agree with your particular example, that in particular racial slurs, how would that advance the conversation, unless we were talking about Twain or the word as a matter of history and so on, hurled as an invective. This is not encouraging of a community or a collegiality. So I completely agree with that. My one proviso would be, I suppose, that the truth, at least in some things, is not simply laid out on a table for us. There are difficult, knotty, moral, religious questions which require dissection, vivisection. And that can lead to, quote-unquote, difficult conversation, should lead to difficult conversations. But on the one hand, it seems to me there are many students who are so averse to even the thought of giving offense that they say nothing or very little. Or they don't say what they think. And other students who have perhaps through experience or through education also have a heightened sensitivity to it, to offense. We've become Geiger counters for offense, as I said. And that has a kind of a chilling effect too. So what I would like to see is some kind of middle ground, a happy medium, a kind of full and frank discussion of sometimes difficult questions, which is respectful. I mean, in a way, the whole architecture that we've laid on top, in some ways, is unnecessary. If you just treat people with a certain ordinary respect. And some of the more recent developments through technology and so on encourage us to drop that basic civility. I disagree with what you say, but I wonder about X. Have you thought about Y? You know, these kind of conversations that I hope go on in the dorm rooms at Clemson all the time. I don't know, but so yeah, I think that's a very good example, and I agree But I also wonder whether there isn't kind of an extreme. I mean, are Clemson students, I teach at Boston College, hurling racial epithets back? No. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't incidents, ugly incidents. I'm not Pollyannish about it, I don't think. But on the other hand, what I see is students bending over backwards to be respectful to one another. Yes. Oh. Yes.
So, on the one hand, there seems to be, as with the hate crimes laws that you spoke of, a dive into the soul, the internal,
Yeah.
to figure out what people are feeling internally, whether it's biased or hateful.
Right.
And then on the other hand, like this implicit bias training and like what is it, the sexual boundaries training that we receive, that we
Right.
all go through, there's an explicit rejection that intent matters. So it's all about, as we spoke of earlier, about
Yeah.
the effect that it has on a person. That's
Right.
all that matters. So is that a self-contradiction, or is that a result of like a prior more foundational premise?
That's a very nice observation. I like that very much. And I'm not sure. I think your facts are correct. At least I went through one such training. I mean, everybody at BC did. It wasn't that I was particularly in need of revision. We all did this. And that does seem to be true, what you say, that in a way the intent could be perfectly innocent, but the crucial thing is the receiver of it. And that, it seems to me, is just, as I in a way said in the paper, an invitation to difficulty, because how can even precisely someone with the innocent motives or intent, it's so difficult to gauge. Whereas in an earlier age, when it wasn't so legalistic, and it hadn't been taken over by people with PhDs, God forbid, there could be a kind of conversation. What did you mean when you said that? I think maybe I misheard you or misunderstood you when you said X, and now it should go through levels of bureaucracy and so on. But yeah, as to the self-contradiction, I don't know, I have to think more about it. That's a very intriguing suggestion.